It was July of 1917. A small rowboat cuts through the surf as U.S. sailors from the Yorktown approach Clipperton Island, which is nothing more than an isolated ring of coral over 1,000 kilometers from the nearest land. Here, there was a colony that since 1914 had been cut off from any food and freshwater supplies. And to make things worse, they had no way to get off this island. The lifeboat landed in silence, and slowly the sailors stepped ashore, scanning the shoreline for any movement or any sign of life. From behind a cluster of sun-bleached huts, the outline of a skeletal woman began to emerge. Behind her were children clinging to her that were too weak to cry. All of them moved like ghosts, their skin sagging as if their bodies had died long ago, but their minds had somehow clung to life. In the center of the island sat a lagoon, and that's where sailors noticed the corpse floating of a mutilated man. They knew something terrible had happened here, and it wasn't just hunger and dehydration. This is a story that began as a fight to survive, but it ended in brutal chaos at the hands of a sadistic man. This is the forgotten nightmare of Clipperton Island. So let's dive into it. Tirza Rendon arrived on Clipperton Island with her husband in the early 1910s. They were full of quiet hope. He was part of a small Mexican garrison sent to guard a lonely speck of land in the vast Pacific. It was a flat, windswept reef that had literally no fresh water, no fertile ground, and no shelter from the relentless sun. At its center was a stagnant, undrinkable lagoon. Every drop of water, every sack of rice or beans had to be shipped from the mainland over 1,200 kilometers away. This island was important as the Mexican government saw it as a way to claim sovereignty in the area to push back on French and American interests. The population here hovered around 90 people, made up of 24 soldiers and workers, their wives, and numerous children. There was actually more children than there were adults, all clinging to the fragile routine of daily life on the edge of nowhere. Most had come reluctantly, just following orders given by the Mexican military, but for the time, the men and their families made it work. The harsh conditions on the island was made livable thanks to the supply ships that kept coming. That was until everything changed, because in 1910, the Mexican Revolution erupted. Governments collapsed, wreckage disappeared, and supply routes completely fell apart. For the first while, ships still came, but less frequently. But by late 1914, the shipments stopped completely, leaving the colonists with no supply of food or water. At one point, a passing French ship dropped an anchor just long enough to deliver the worst kind of news. War had broken out, and essentially, the colony in Clipperton Island had been forgotten about. The islanders were told to evacuate, but unfortunately, they had no way to leave, and they had to sit there helplessly and watch that ship sail away without them, not knowing what exactly would happen to them. At first, Tirza and her husband believed rescue would come, because they didn't really think that Mexico would forget about them. And the revolution itself, well, it couldn't last forever. They knew that a ship eventually would have to appear on the horizon, bring crates of rice, salt and beans, and fresh water. They expected a signal from the mainland to reach them any day now. Unfortunately, that would turn into days and then months. But Tirza, alongside the other colonists, worked to survive. They knew they would have to get food, so they were able to scavenge fish from the reef, trap seabirds, and dig up turtle eggs. Everything that they caught had to be rationed down to the last ounce, because the last tins of beans and last supply of rice and fresh water were pretty much gone. At times, there was days where adult men would only get a single teaspoon of food, and there wasn't much more for the children. Water had become so scarce, they had to start collecting it by any means they could. So they gathered canvas that had washed ashore in storms and used it to soak up rainwater from puddles and bring it into containers. But unfortunately, the weather was unpredictable, which often meant they would go days or weeks without actually getting any new fresh water. By the time the first year passed, no one even spoke of rescue anymore. They literally just trudged on with their daily routine of just trying to scrape by. But despite all their efforts, there just wasn't enough fresh water and food to keep everyone's bodies healthy. And Tirza watched her husband grow thinner by the day. Slowly, his shoulders drooped. Then his eyes sunk in, and even his thinking became impaired from the malnutrition. He rarely smiled anymore, it was said, and around her, the other men, just like him, began to slip as quickly. Some of them couldn't even leave their beds or hammocks. And this is when the dying began. Some men just simply wouldn't wake up, while others would collapse mid-step on the reef and their bodies being dragged out to sea. When they could, graves were dug with bare hands. At first, they would bury them neatly with crosses and names carved into firewood, but soon there became too many, and they were simply given nameless graves. Now, the records are not entirely clear as to the exact number of people on the island, but by this time, in early 1916, nearly half the population had died, roughly 40 to 50 people, which was made up of 26 men, a few women, and unfortunately, a number of children. Whispers began to pass between the women because not every death here made sense. One man was found with bruises on his neck. Another was found slumped beside the lagoon who had a gash across his head, but there was no blood nearby, as if he had been moved. Another man just vanished entirely. Some thought maybe he walked into the sea, or maybe he had drowned and was washed away. But Tirza's thoughts raced. She knew something was up on that island, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Was somebody among them a murderer, or was this just a case of bad luck? And unfortunately, that bad luck continued, and Tirza, shortly after this, had to bury her own husband, who also succumbed to starvation and illness. And when she was done burying her husband in that shallow grave, she looked up, she realized something alarming. All of the men on the island had died, except for one, and his name was Victoriano Álvarez, who was a lighthouse keeper. He was a loner who was said to be odd and quiet. Well, we got an incel trapped on an island with a bunch of women. I don't know what could go wrong. But what I do know is I need your support, so consider subscribing to the channel, or really, maybe tell someone we exist, because the Mexican government also forgot about me. Thank you, and I'll move on. Victoriano Álvarez had once been a joke among the soldiers, and now, with every man gone, he stood apart, watching, silent and unblinking, as if he had found a new confidence. And Tirza caught his gaze from across the camp, and something in her chest turned cold. There was a hunger in his eyes, not for food, but for power and control. And unbelievably, for everything they had been through, the real horror hadn't begun yet, but it was coming. And now, none of their husbands and none of the men were left to stop it. At first, Álvarez just watched. He lingered near the edges of the camp, saying nothing, but slowly his silence became a presence. He began walking through the shelters, not asking, but inspecting. And when people protested against him, he made it official. He claimed that he was the only officer left on the entire island, and therefore he was in charge. Everyone must follow his rule, and even declared himself the king of Clipperton. Some people on the island just stared at him, too weak to argue. But Tirza knew this was bad. Álvarez slowly gathered what weapons remained around the island: machetes, knives, and even cooking tools, and he carried them all down to the lagoon. One by one, he threw them into the water, everything but one rifle, which he kept slung over his shoulder like a crown. This is when Álvarez started to make his own rules for the island. He would decide who got food, who got water, who got shelter. The women were to report to him directly about anything happening on the island, and unfortunately, he would begin choosing women who would stay in his hut at night, rotating them like assignments. He was able to assert control by essentially rewarding small groups of the larger group with water and food so that they would help him carry out his bidding. And for the others, well, they were too weak to really fight back. But slowly, power wasn't enough for Álvarez, and he started to become violent. The first time that he struck someone, it was completely without warning. He slapped someone, then punched, and nobody stepped in. Álvarez would start to give orders that made no sense. Stand here, dig here, don't speak and don't move. If someone would hesitate, he lashed out. He would accuse women of stealing and punish them by withholding rations. If anyone spoke up against him, again, they were cut off from food or water, or even worse, their children were. He spent so much time tormenting the women that the children went completely unacknowledged unless they were screaming, and at that point, sometimes Álvarez would hit them too. Even though Álvarez was significantly outnumbered, his control over the food and water seemed to be enough to keep everybody under his rule. It was apparent to the people, though, that Álvarez had lost his mind. Tirza did what she could to keep her head down. She didn't want to become one of Álvarez's assignments. Each night, she would lay beside her kids, listening to the wind scratch across the tent flaps, praying that Álvarez wasn't coming to summon her to his tent. She understood at this point, it wasn't survival anymore. They were in captivity. Álvarez would patrol the island with a rifle at different times of day and night, so the women never really knew when he was going to strike or what he was going to do. Álvarez didn't just demand obedience, he demanded submission. And when it came to the women, he just simply took what he wanted. And those that wouldn't help him carry out his sick fantasies, well, were essentially just left to starve. Many more people would die during Álvarez's reign. Said that he would select his victims one at a time. First Altagracia, then Rosalia, then some of Tirza's friends. And unfortunately, a lot of these girls were very young, and I don't even want to say their ages because it's almost too unsettling to me. Now, if the women refused him, they were beaten to the edge of death. When he would grow bored of them, he would toss them out like garbage, stripped of food, shelter, and even water. One woman, after being cast out for disobedience, disappeared entirely. Sickly, Álvarez would go on to call some of the women his wives. But everyone knew what they really were. They were slaves, passed through his hut like rations. Some were even forced to live with him for weeks at a time. Others, only once. Tirza watched her friends slowly change. One even became catatonic. And all this was unfolding while Álvarez wandered the camp like he was a god, talking to himself, smugly, with his rifle on his shoulder, daring people to challenge him. Tirza kept her head down, and she watched Álvarez closely, because she knew eventually he was going to have to slip up. She confided her disdain for Álvarez in a woman who became one of her closest friends on the island, Alicia Arnaud. She'd become her anchor and more than just a friend. Really, it was her lifeline to survival in this, because without her, she probably would have lost her mind. They had buried their husbands together in the same week. They would lean on each other as much as they could to get through this horrible ordeal. These two women even shared a tent. And unfortunately, one night, Álvarez came to the shelter, but not for Tirza. He told her plainly that Alicia would be next to be his wife, and she would have one day to pack. Tirza didn't even speak. She began to cry. She didn't sleep at all that night. She just laid awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to her children breathe beside her, but this time, something was different. Because Tirza decided she wasn't going to be helpless anymore, and that's when she started planning. She knew if she didn't do something now, there would be no surviving this man. The only choice in front of her was stopping him. She couldn't bear to see another friend taken from her. Tirza didn't act immediately. She waited because Álvarez had said that Alicia had one night to prepare, just like all the others he had taken. And this time, while the camp was silent, Tirza took the opportunity to approach Alicia and whisper as quiet as she could, "We have to end this tonight." Alicia simply nodded. She didn't ask how, she didn't ask when, or even why. And this is when Tirza knew she wasn't alone. She also knew that the other women on the island had seen too much and lost too much, and must be willing to help too. And Tirza knew they had the upper hand now, because between them all, they knew his habits. When he drank, when he barked orders, and when he let his guard down. So gathering some of the other women around their shelter and letting them in on this, they made a simple plan. One of the women would slip a hammer behind a collapsed shelter near Álvarez's hut. Another would pass Álvarez's hut to distract him with small talk. There was no big meeting over this, there was no big speeches. There was just a quiet acknowledgement that they all wanted the same thing. Among them, they chose the morning, because Álvarez here had always let his guard down at dawn. This is before the shouting and before the hunger made him paranoid. This would be their moment. Alicia agreed to go first. She would be the bait. And at dawn, Alicia approached Álvarez, hands trembling, voice steady. She told him she needed help with some of her heavy objects near the waterline in order to move into his hut. He grumbled and he was irritated, but followed her out. But just outside, Tirza was waiting. She had taken the hidden hammer and stayed out of sight behind broken timbers, ready. And as Álvarez stepped into the clearing, distracted and unarmed, Tirza rose and swung as hard as she could. One blow to the back of the head, sharp, fast, and deliberate. Álvarez stumbled, howling wildly, and he lunged back towards the hut where the rifle was leaning just inside. But Tirza was on him. Quickly, she landed another strike and then another. Alicia was screaming. Some say Tirza stabbed him afterwards to make sure he wouldn't get it up, but that detail is unclear. But shortly after the attack, there was complete silence. The women said little to each other. They simply dragged his body to the edge of the lagoon and pushed it in like he was an animal. For the first time in over a year, no one held a gun to these women's heads. No one barked orders, and no one had to fear that Álvarez would come to their tent that night, beckoning them. Tirza stood back, and the others stood by in silence, watching the sun rise over the calm of the island. At this point, there was only 11 survivors who had nothing left but hunger and a will to see each other survive. So that's crazy. If you go back to earlier in the story, that half of people died in the first year or two being on the island. In the next few months to a year under Álvarez's rule, nearly all of the other half would die as well, except for these 11 women and a few children. But unfortunately, killing Álvarez didn't bring a lot of relief, because very quickly Tirza remembered how bad their situation was. Sure, the monster was dead, but there was nothing to celebrate, because they still had to face the same unbearable heat, the same empty food stores, the same lack of fresh water, and just trying to survive one of the harshest environments you could think of. And the women, unfortunately, also still had children to feed, but somehow they had to figure this out, and they had to pull themselves together to survive. Against all odds, somehow, after being there for years with no sign of rescue, under this guy's crazy rule, only 3 or 4 days after Álvarez is dead, the women saw the silhouette of a boat approaching the island. Some of them were so traumatized, they hid behind their huts, not sure what kind of threat whoever was coming could be. But as the boat approached closer and they realized that the vessel was friendly, the survivors rushed from behind their huts, waving scraps of cloth and collapsing in the sand. At this point, there was 4 women and 7 children who were pulled off of that island. Everyone else was gone. Álvarez's body was left where it was, bloating and letting the crabs eat it. Eventually, he would be claimed to the sea. At first, the American sailors on the USS Yorktown were horrified, because these women literally looked like they were dead. But Captain Peril, trying to protect the survivors, kept the darkest parts out of his report. No mention of abuse, no mention of how it ended. And Clipperton Island was never resettled again. France eventually claimed legal ownership, but no other colonies were ever placed there, and there's been no one living in the island since. The women would return home with their children, but never received any hero's welcome. There was no medals, no headlines, just a quiet re-entry into Mexico, still tearing itself apart in the revolution. Now, the official report filed by the U.S. Navy, it didn't mention Álvarez. It didn't mention the abuse, the starvation, or the killing. It was essentially just sanitized. But in Mexico, the government interviewed Tirza and the people that survived. There was no trial, and there was no big news story. But in the official records, there did sit interviews, personal letters, and testimony that was collected over the years. Rumors even swirled that a sailor on the Yorktown passed information along to journalists. And a lot of this information sat idle for years until journalists started investigating some old records and pulled this story from the archives. And the historians started asking questions, like why was there only a few survivors? Why was there no inquiry? And when they started to dig deeper into this incident, that's when the truth about Álvarez's reign comes to light. They find Tirza's interviews and testimony and the story of her defiance, which is absolutely incredible to see how these women banded together to take this bastard down. The story that unfolded on Clipperton Island became a lesson in psychology about not only power dynamics during a survival situation, but how about, given the opportunity, people's darkest desires will come out and you'll see a monster emerge that you never even knew existed. I just want to say thanks for joining in, and I'll be back again next week with another episode. I hope you enjoyed this one.